the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. She opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny, of a people, with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery.
Good morning and welcome. Before I get into the issue of today, let me state that an incredible Washington, D.C. based journalist, Derek Ward, passed on Tuesday from a heart attack. He was 62 years old. Derek was a phenomenal journalist, particularly dealing with Washington, D.C. based issues. He was with the Washington, D.C. local NBC affiliate, Channel 4. Phenomenal guy, phenomenal journalist, and he will be missed. Rest in peace, Derek Ward. Folks, we are now 11 days away from Trump 47, Trump Redux. What can we expect in terms of the economic impact for the middle class, for the working class, and for poor Americans? Last week, the Washington Post had a piece entitled 10 Policies Republicans Could Use to Pay for New Tax Cuts. Extending the expiring 2017 tax cuts could add $5 trillion to the national debt. Trump and Republican lawmakers are considering these policies to offset that cost. In December, Congress averted a government shutdown as the Senate passed a continuing resolution. There was a very interesting paragraph in the Washington Post, a story about this bilateral agreement to continue, allow the government to continue functioning. Quote, Johnson, that's House Speaker, appeared to have split the debt ceiling question from the struggle to keep the government open. Instead of acting on it now, he proposed a handshake deal with fiscal hawks in his own party to try next year, listen to this, to slash mandatory spending programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans health care, and food stamps by at least $2.5 trillion, while raising the debt cap by $1.5 trillion, according to folks familiar with the details. In my opinion, these tax cuts look great for Wall Street, but won't bode well for the people on Main Street. Let's connect some dots.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is who pays for the extension of the Trump 47 tax cuts and the new cuts he's proposing? What happens to the debt, to the deficit, and what happens to spending on social programs? For insight into this, let's turn to my guest. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, former president of the National Economics Association. He is Dr. Linwood Tauheed. Happy New Year to you, my brother. I've been waiting to have this conversation with you for the past few weeks, so I'm so glad you're here. Again, Happy New Year and welcome.
Happy New Year to you also, and thank you. Also been wanting to have this conversation with you.
So let's start with this Washington Post piece, 10 policies Republicans could use to pay for new tax cuts. Advisors to President-elect Trump and congressional Republicans have begun floating proposals to boost federal revenue and slash spending, so their plans for major tax cuts and new security spending won't further explode the $36.2 trillion national debt. That sounds to me, Dr. Tauheed, like great rhetoric, but I think it's wishful thinking. I think it's whistling past the graveyard. I think it's more hyperbole and spin than reality. Your thoughts on that objective before we get into some of the specific points, Dr. Tauheed?
Yes, this idea of extending the 2017 Trump tax cuts, which, as you indicated, is estimated to actually cost about $5 trillion over the next 10 years. Is positioned as being, quote, deficit neutral. Now that's a wonderful term. I mean, you know, it's not going to add to the deficit. It won't decrease the deficit. But you have to understand, deficit neutral, when tax cuts are being proposed, means that as the government brings in less revenue because of tax cuts, deficit neutral means something has to be cut in terms of spending. It's not that these tax cuts are going to increase government revenue, although there is a theory that says that happens, that when you decrease the taxes on the wealthy, they invest. They use those tax cuts to invest in their companies, which increases economic activity. That's an economic theory which has no empirical evidence, no support for it, particularly in modern times where the corporations that get tax cuts simply use that to pay dividends or to increase bonuses or to buy back stock. It doesn't end up in investment. And so, and that's the history of the tax of the Trump tax cut, also going all the way back to the Bush 2 tax cuts in the beginning of the 21st century. And so, tax cuts in this case never end up increasing economic activity and never end up increasing government revenue. which means that deficit neutral means you have to cut somewhere. And that somewhere that's being proposed is in what they would call discretionary spending, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security is not discretionary spending, but there's another narrative that's being circulated in terms of the ability of Social Security to continue to make payments in the future. It's all connected with this idea of having tax cuts, reduce revenue, meaning the government has to reduce spending. And so those social programs that are targeted, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are the programs that are going to make the deficit neutral, because government revenue decreases will also make government spending decreases, and that will hurt. We talk about Main Street versus Wall Street. That will hurt Wall Street, that will hurt Main Street, while Wall Street gets increased wealth and by lowering taxes.
And Holistic Politics writes, what's the federal budget ratio of military spending? Mm-hmm. And that's a great question. I was going to get to that point a little later, but might as well mention that now. And that is, when you look at the money that's been committed, that has been authorized to go to Ukraine, when you look at what we're spending right now in occupied Palestine, and that, I can only assume, commitment is only going to go up as the hostilities increase. Still trying to pick a fight with China over Taiwan. The military spending is going to. In fact, one of the things that Donald Trump talks about is security spending. Mm-hmm. And I'd say the best way to make us more secure is to stop traversing the globe trying to pick fights with folks. And particularly fights we can't win.
Yes, the U.S. Military has over 800 bases around the world. Most of those bases are close to China and Russia in an attempt to, project power into those areas, power far away from the U.S. Those 800 bases being close to potential enemies that the U.S. is going to make out of Russia and China are very active targets, if you will, or targets of convenience for Russia and China. Now, those military bases the process of creating these military bases close to Russia and China started during the old Cold War. And in those times, we could argue that the military spending in the U.S. made the military of the U.S. military superior to Russian military, Soviet Union military, and Chinese military. That's not the case today. The Ukraine war has demonstrated that Russia has weaponry that's not only much cheaper, about 1/10 the cost of U.S. weaponry, but is in fact superior to U.S. weaponry. The Russian military has innovated over the 20 years of Putin's control there, presidency and premiership, and has developed military hardware that is superior to the U.S. U.S. military hardware is expensive and mostly does not work. The F-35 fighter is something that is perennially a problem. It doesn't work as specified. Its specifications now means that it cannot fly in a severe thunderstorm. Mm-hmm. And so Russia and now China, which has, I believe, a 6th generation plane, their aircraft are not subject to those restrictions. And so we spend a lot of money, over $1 trillion. I mean, the budget is 860, I think, billion officially, but then there's extra money that gets thrown in. So it's over $1 trillion. The U.S. military spends over $1 trillion in this security spending, and gets about 1/10 of the value back for that spending. But that part of the budget, you know, the military budget in the U.S. is discretionary. It doesn't have to be at a certain level. It could be lowered, but it never is. And if I remember correctly, it's about 1/3 of the entire U.S. budget, and it continues to grow. And so while the Social Security, Medicare, and these other discretionary spending packages are going to be decreased as a result of this continuing resolution and the extension of the tax cuts, the military budget will not be decreased. And we can see, you know, I expect that spending in Ukraine will decrease. That doesn't mean that we'll get a peace dividend. That means that money will just be diverted to spending, perhaps in for Israel in its genocide in Palestine, or it will go to trying to create additional threats to China by diverting money into the Chinese into that part of the world. And so the military budget will not decrease.
And we'll talk. We're going to get into a conversation about West Africa later. We know what's going on with the Sahel states, for example. We can only expect that conflict to increase as we're seeing weaponry and fighters from Syria and from Ukraine making their way. And also, I think it's important for people to understand that when we talk about defense spending, you're not only talking about money that is specifically earmarked or targeted for the Pentagon or the Department of Defense. You're also looking at supporting agencies such as the Department of Energy, that they have elements of their budgets that are targeted towards defense spending as well. So, and then there's also the part of the defense budget that is a black line. We don't know exactly how much. So the amount of money that the United States is pouring, and it's not defense at all, it's offense, and it's not making us safer, it's making us weaker. But with that having been said, I want to unpack a couple of the items that were listed in this Washington Post article, because I think that there's some real clarity that is needed here. The first line item that they list, the 10 policies Republicans could use to pay for new tax cuts. I want to go through just about 5 of them. Impose new tariffs. And they are projecting that the imposition of new tariffs will generate about $2.7 trillion in revenue. Quote, "To me," Trump said at a news conference in late December, "tariffs, the most beautiful word in the dictionary." Trump campaigned on new tariffs on all imports, plus additional levies on Chinese imports. Now, I know that he has backed away from some of that language. He's not calling on tariffs on all imports. He's using the word targeted now. But what I think is really important for people to understand, tariffs are taxes. So when they say we're not going to raise taxes, oh yes, you are. Would a rose by any other name smell as sweet, as Shakespeare would say in Romeo and Juliet? I think that was. Is a tax by any other measure is still going to get into my pocket, Dr. Tauheed.
Yes, to kind of explain quickly what a tariff is and how it works. The Biden administration put a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, which means that a Chinese manufacturer of an EV that might sell for, let's say, $50,000 without the tariff, now is going to cost to be imported $100,000, 100% tariff. Now, who pays that? Who pays that increased tariff? Who pays for that tariff, that tax? Well, the seller, the Chinese seller, doesn't pay the tax. It is the importer that pays the tax. And so the buyer of the electric vehicle, which would have been purchased for $50,000, now has to pay $50,000 to the seller, but also now has to pay $50,000 to the U.S. government as a tariff. That makes the cost of that vehicle $100,000. And if it's going to be sold in the US, then the buyer, who is going to now become the seller to the consumer, is going to want to get that $50,000 back. And that means that the cost of the vehicle is going to go up at least $50,000, but it'll actually go up higher than that because these sellers want to maintain their profit margin. And so if a vehicle, a $50,000 vehicle, has a profit margin of 100%, and that might seem ridiculous, but I'll give you an example. Then an extra $50,000 means that to maintain the profit margin, the cost of that vehicle is not going to go up 50,000 with the tariff. It's going to go up another 100,000. In other words, the cost of the vehicle is going to double. And when that happens, of course, for an electric vehicle, people who want electric vehicles or are willing to pay lots of money can do that. But that was on a tariff on electric vehicles. If we have tariffs on other things that come from China that are purchased by ordinary consumers, those prices are going to go up as well. And what Trump has proposed is a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, 10%